Revelation in the 12th chapter. Before we get in to the 12th chapter tonight, we left off last week in the 11th chapter, and we see here where John sees, it says in verse 19, "Then the temple of God was opened in heaven, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple, and there were lightnings, noises, thunders, an earthquake, and great hail." We talked about the resemblance of this being when Moses met with God at Mount Sinai. Anytime we see the presence of God come down, there are these thunders and these lightnings and these earthquakes, and there's this great hail. We experience somewhat of this maybe when Moses brings the Ark of the Covenant into the tent of meetings and the Shekinah glory fills the temple. We see this again maybe when Solomon brings the Ark of the Covenant into the temple and the Shekinah glory of God again fills the temple place there. But there were some questions here on this Ark of the Covenant. What is it that John is actually seeing? And then when we began to look at this Ark of the Covenant, it raises even more questions about the Ark itself. And there's all these speculations about where the Ark is today and what's going on and all those kind of things. And so we had several asking questions last week after our study. And, sometimes you ask questions that raise questions for me, things that I hadn't thought about asking. So sometimes it's not that we don't know the answers, it's sometimes we don't even know what question to ask. And so as you ask questions, it kind of spurs my questions, and so I get to dig a little more. And so let me just share a little bit here. The Ark of the Covenant is most likely was destroyed under the Babylonian capture of Jerusalem. It was likely burned when Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had leveled Jerusalem and destroying the temple and all those kind of things. There's some interesting passages that kind of correlate with this. Let me show you one verse. First of all, in Jeremiah chapter 3, in verse 16. Jeremiah chapter 3, in verse 16. He says, "Then it shall come to pass, when you are multiplied and increased in the land in those days, says the Lord, that they will say no more, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. It shall not come to mind, nor shall they remember it, nor shall they visit it, nor shall it be made anymore." A lot of implications there. The last statement there, "nor shall it be made anymore," it implies to me that it is going to be destroyed. Jeremiah is prophesying about the time that Jerusalem is going to fall captive. There's some prophecy here that they're going to lose sight of the ark and that the ark is actually going to be destroyed. And Scripture says that it's not even going to be made anymore. Now, I don't say that emphatically, but I say that there's the implication there that Jeremiah gives us. The greater truth of this passage is that they are going to lose the significance of the ark. It's going to be wiped out of their mind. They're not even going to think about it anymore. It's going to become irrelevant almost to the Jews, okay? Now, and it's not been mentioned since then. Now, there's a couple of other verses. The last kind of chronological reference of the ark in the Old Testament is 2 Chronicles chapter 35. If you want to follow along, 2 Chronicles chapter 35, look in verse 3. 2 Chronicles 35, and notice in verse 3. "Then he said to the Levites, who taught all Israel, who were holy to the Lord, put the holy ark in the house which Solomon the son David, king of Israel, built. It shall no longer be a burden on your shoulders. Now serve the Lord your God and his people Israel." So this is the last place that it's mentioned being put into the temple that Solomon builds. Now, what happened to it after that is really not known. Many scholars believe that it perished when Shishak invaded during Manasseh's time, when Nebuchadnezzar burned the temple, all those kind of things. A couple of other places in 1 Kings chapter 14. I'm having to look these up with you now, so you ought to be able to keep up. 1 Kings in the 14th chapter. Look what it says in verse 25. 1 Kings chapter 14 in verse 25. It happened in the 5th year of King Rehoboam that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and he took away everything. He also took away all the gold shields which Solomon had made. In 2 Kings chapter 25, it's another reference of where all of these things are being taken out of the temple. 2 Kings 25 in verse 9. He burned the house of the Lord and the king's house, all the houses of Jerusalem, that is, all the houses of the great. He burned with fire. And so, again, we see where the ark is being taken. Things in the temple are all being destroyed. Now, there's some Jewish tradition that says that Jeremiah took that Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 16, is a reference to Jeremiah's knowledge of the ark. And in the second Maccabee, it's a book that wasn't canonized in our New Testament, in the 2nd chapter, it says this in verse 4. It was also contained in the same writing how the prophet, being warned by God, commanded that the tabernacle and the ark should accompany him, till he came forth to the mountain where Moses went up and saw the inheritance of God. And when Jeremiah came thither, he found a hollow cave, and he carried it thither, the tabernacle and the ark and the altar of incense, and so stopped the door. Then some of them that followed him came up to mark the place, but they could not find it. And when Jeremiah perceived it, he blamed them, saying, the place shall be unknown till God gather together the congregation of the people and receive them to mercy. And then the Lord will show these things, and the majesty of the Lord shall appear, and there shall be a cloud as it was also showed to Moses. And he showed it when Solomon prayed that the place might be sanctified to the great God. So based on that passage in 2 Maccabee, there's the thought then that Jeremiah took that ark and hid it in some cave in Mount Sinai, or on Mount Sinai. And so most likely the Catholic Church knows where that's at, and they're erecting a shrine around it. And one day they're going to give tours and charge money to come see it. If you remember some of our study in the book of Acts, there's a lot of those places, and when we studied the life of the 12 apostles, and we studied about their martyrdom and their death, a lot of them have shrines, and their burial places are known, and all those kind of things, and for the right amount of money, you can go see those places. But nevertheless, so I'm not really sure. But we do know this: when the temple was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar, it's rebuilt again. Ezra and Nehemiah are major people that are involved in that. Okay, so they rebuild the temple again. Ezra chapter 6 and verse 19 talks about the articles being brought into the temple, all those kind of things. We also know that in the day of Jesus, there was still that Holy of Holies that was in the temple. Remember when Jesus was crucified, and the veil that separated the Holy of Holies was rent from top to bottom? Okay? So there's still the Holy of Holies there. But what's interesting is that some think that there was this stone that was placed in the Holy of Holies that was supposedly the stone that Jacob, when he slept and and saw the vision from God and anointed it as an altar, that stone is been kept through all those years, and it was placed in the temple, and that's what they were coming to bring their sacrifices to. Interesting concepts, okay? But they're nevertheless, they're still bringing their sacrifices, but they're bringing their sacrifices to what you could classify as an empty altar. And we know that altar, that the altar in the temple is insignificant. It's been made insignificant by the altar of Jesus Christ. It's His shed blood that cleanses us from all unrighteousness. Let me show you a verse in Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews in the 9th chapter. Look there with me. Hebrews chapter 9, look in verse 1 first of all. Then indeed, even the first covenant had ordinances of divine service and an earthly sanctuary. For a tabernacle was prepared, the first part, in which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. So that's what's thought to be in the temple, in the second temple. And behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle which is called the holiest of all, which had the golden censer, and the ark of the covenant, overlaid on all the sides of the gold, in which were the golden pot and that had the manna, Aaron's rod, the budded, and the tablets of the covenant. He's describing that Old Testament temple in the Holy of Holies, above which were the cherubim, the glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of all these, we cannot now speak in detail. They've lost it. Basically, is what he's saying. They've again, fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy. They've lost it. They can't really even speak to that anymore. Then notice what it says down in verse 23. Therefore, it was necessary that the copies of the things in heaven should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifice than these. For Christ has not entered the holy place made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. He's gone into the heavenly Holy of Holies. And so I kind of think this is all the way around full circle now. Get back to this Ark of the Covenant that John sees in heaven. I don't think this is the Ark of the Covenant that the Israelites had. That was destroyed. That was lost. When King Nebuchadnezzar destroyed. But this is the heavenly ark. This is what Christ, this is the sacrifice that Christ makes on our behalf. Okay? So what John saw was not the earthly ark, but a heavenly counterpart. This was the fulfillment of what that earthly foreshadowing represented. Okay? Now you know what I know. No questions. Okay? All right. Am I sure about that? I am as sure about that today. Oh, sure. Ask your question. Okay? Right. Right. Yeah, the statement being, and I agree, and I think Hebrews speaks to that, okay? Hebrews chapter 9, when you read the verses prior to that, says in verse 22, and according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. Okay? So, and we'll look at that passage again in just a few minutes. But yes, the picture is that Christ, when he died on the cross, went into the heavenly Holy of Holies. and his blood, a perfect sacrificial lamb, once and for all. He didn't have to go make a sacrifice for himself as the Old Testament priest did, because he was a perfect sacrifice himself. And that perfect sacrifice, once and for all, has been given. Whereas the Old Testament earthly priest would have to come back time and time again to offer up the blood of that sacrificial lamb and all of that. Okay? Yeah. There's we won't have time to address all of that on video, but that really you can look here in Hebrews chapter 9, all through Hebrews chapter 9, chapter 10, 9 and 10 both. They look through that. That speaks a lot to Christ being the perfect sacrificial lamb. Yeah. Sure. It's a good. Yeah. Yeah. The question is, it was Uzzah, or Uzzah, however you want to pronounce his name, when David was bringing the ark back and was going to bring it into Jerusalem, they were carrying it on an oxen cart. And as the oxen stumbled and the ark was about to fall, Uzzah put his hand on it to hold it, and God killed him. But we also know that it had been in Gentile, pagan territory. They had it. They handled it. If you remember, they put it on a cart, and with the cows, oxen pulling it, and they sent it up the road by itself, and it, God directed, and none of them died. So, but they all got sick. Yeah, it's never been good for those. And we're just talking off the cuff here. They take the ark after Uzzah touches the ark and he dies. Then David's like, we're not bringing it here. So he sends it to Obed, and they're over there being blessed by God. Well, I don't know that it was necessarily being taken care of according to the Levitical law at Obed, but God was blessing them. So there's. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. The proper way to carry the ark was the rings on the side. They put the poles in. The priests, those specific priests that had been assigned that duty, were to carry it and that sort of thing. So, yeah. I don't know why God. And again, the significance of the ark represented the presence and the mercy seat of God. And it was simply a foreshadowing of Christ. I was talking about the fact that Hebrews 9, Hebrews 10 speak a lot to this. Mr. LJ pointed out specifically Hebrews 10 and verse 10. By that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Christ once for all. So through his sacrifice. Right, and talks about and describes how the Old Testament priest and the similarities there, okay? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah. So so for our purpose tonight on the ark, one thing leads to another. Yeah. Jeremiah prophesied, "Hey, you're going to lose the ark. It's going to be out of sight, out of mind," and it works out the time. Okay. Chapter 12. Two more questions and we'd have been out of time. Hebrews chapter 12. Or excuse me, Revelation chapter 12. Y'all got me out of place now. Revelation in the 12th chapter. He says, "Now a great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days." Stop right here as we get into chapter 12. Chapter 12 is going to give us the basis of what's going to be said in the rest and what's going to be revealed in the rest of Revelation here. So it's important that we kind of get these things right. From chapter 12 through chapter 14, most scholars classify this as the book of signs. We think a lot about signs and symbolism in the book of Revelation, but there's really no signs mentioned in the first 11 chapters. Everything that's given to us in those first 11 chapters are things that he sees, okay? And we're going to continue with that, but it's going to be like signs now. There's 3 signs that are in heaven. We see one here. It says, "Now a great sign appeared in heaven." That's verse 1. He says again in verse 3, "And another sign appeared in heaven." And then in chapter 15, there's going to be a sign. Those 3 signs are all in heaven. And then there are 4 signs on earth. And we'll get those in chapter 13, 16, 19, through those passages there. But there's only one good sign. And that's here, chapter 12 in verse 1. There's also the mention of 7 personages, if you will, here in 12 and 13. We see the woman here in chapter 12. We've already seen mention of a dragon. We see the male child here in verse 5. That's the Lord Jesus Christ. We'll fill in the blanks here in a minute. Verse 7, when we get into that, we're going to see Michael, who represents the angels. We see the remnant, the regenerate of Israel here in chapter 12 down in verse 17. We see the beast out of the sea, which is the world dictator in chapter 13. We see the beast out of the earth, which is a false prophet or a false religious leader of the world. That's in chapter 13, verse 11. So we see these different personages that will come into play. Understand that the dragon, the Antichrist, the beast, all of these are really point to the devil and his work, okay? There's a warfare that's mentioned here. There's going to be a war here on earth. There's a war in heaven, and then again on earth again. We talk a lot about wars, and when you think about Revelation, you think about wars kind of a lot. We think about the battle of Gog and Magog and the battle of Armageddon. Again, we've talked previously that Gog and Magog takes place at the beginning of the tribulation. Then the battle of Armageddon takes place before the millennial reign of Christ. That's in chapter 19. Just be mindful that all of life is a battle. It's a spiritual warfare. Sometimes we get so caught up in the battle of Armageddon or the battle of Gog and Magog, and the blood and being up to the horse's bridle and all those kind of things. And listen, whatever war we have here on earth, it's almost as though those things that we were talking about in the Old Testament being foreshadows of Christ. The wars that we experience here on earth, that's minor compared to the spiritual warfare that's taking place. Okay? We're talking about the battle for the souls of men and women, boys and girls. That's the significant battles, okay? So let's look at these first 6 verses here. First of all, these are the mysterious wonders in heaven. He says there in verse 1, a great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven. If you're looking at the King James Version, it says, and there appeared a great wonder in heaven. This word wonder, it means something extraordinary, something miraculous, and it's identified as a sign, okay? The woman here, you have to understand who she is. Some try to interpret this as being Mary giving birth to Jesus, and that just doesn't fit in with the Scriptures. When you get to verse 6, just for an example, then the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,200. We're talking about Israel in the 3.5 years of tribulation, okay? Last 3.5 years of the tribulation. Some people want to think that this is the church. The church is raptured. So the church, it can't be the church because the church is not there during the tribulation, okay? So if there's somebody that wants to make that the church, to say, look, the church is going to be here through the tribulation, well, tell them to change their membership and go to another church, okay? I don't want to be in that church that's going to be there, okay? So I don't really think it's the church necessarily either, okay? So we see that it's, well, Genesis 37 in verse 9. Joseph has a dream, remember? Says that, I had this dream, told his father, I had this dream, the sun and the moon and the stars, the 12 stars all bowed down before me and that sort of thing. And so this is the picture here that we see, again, that it's the sun with the moon under her feet and her head a garland of 12 stars. It's a picture of Israel. It's a picture of the nation of Israel there. Verse 5 says that woman gives birth to Christ. Again, it's the symbolism that points to Israel, that the Messiah was going to come out of specifically the tribe of Judah, of the Israelites. Isaiah 54. Turn there with me. Isaiah in the 54th chapter. It's hard to cover everything in a time frame, and we would never get through with this, because just like tonight, when you start talking about the ark, somebody's got a question that doesn't have anything to do with anything. No, I'm just and you just it's easy to chase. I do the same thing, and sometimes I tell Rhonda, sometimes I'm like, I just have to quit studying, otherwise we'll never get out of here. So you just take what you can. But so tonight we've already kind of run through some stuff, so I'm going to kind of slow down here and look for just a second. Isaiah 54, look what it says in verse 5. For your Maker is your husband. The Lord of hosts is his name. And your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. He is called the God of the whole earth. For the Lord has called you like a woman forsaken and grieved in spirit, like a youthful wife when you were refused, says your God. Isaiah describes Israel as a woman, as a wife, okay? So again, it gives to the fact that this woman in Revelation is Israel. Isaiah chapter 60. Isaiah in the 60th chapter. In verse 1. He says, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon you. For behold, the darkness shall cover the earth, and deep darkness the people. But the Lord will arise over you, and his glory will be seen upon you. The Gentiles shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising." Then look what he says in verse 20. "Your sun shall no longer go down, nor shall your moon withdraw itself. For the Lord will be your everlasting light, and the days of your mourning shall be ended." Again, this sun and this moon all refer to Israel, the nation of Israel, over and over again. Warren Wiersbe points out the fact that this woman who is in travail, this child that is born, is Christ. And he makes an interesting comment. When you look at that verse, look in Revelation there, 12, look what it says in verse 5. "She shall bore a male child who was to rule the nations with a rod of iron." The very next sentence says, "And her child was caught up to the God and his throne." Wiersbe points out that between the first and second sentence of verse 5, there's 33 years or so. The life of Christ. That he's born of the woman, and then he's called up to the Father. And then he says in verse 6, "Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days." So between verse 5 and verse 6 is the entire church age. All the way up until the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. It's right there. Okay? So we're really seeing a broad view of what's taken place. Okay? It's in that parenthetical passage here. There's really, the time frame is very broad. These are things that have happened prior to the tribulation. He's trying to kind of connect the dots for us so that we can understand what's going on during the tribulation. So he's having to kind of give us some back information to make sense of what we're going to get to in the future as well. Okay? And so here's this mysterious, these mysterious signs here in heaven. We see the woman, and then we also see the dragon. It says here, verse 3: "And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his head." This dragon. That word means a mythical monster or a dragon or a large serpent. It kind of takes us back to Genesis chapter 3 and the serpent that was deceived. 12 times it's used to describe the devil, starting here in verse 3, okay, through the rest of Revelation. We see here he has the heads, there's the horns, and there's the crowns. Look in chapter 13, verse 1. "Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads, 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name." It's the same thing. He's looking at it again, okay? He's giving us that description again, but look at all the verses that are between there. So he keeps reminding us of who these are. He uses it kind of as an identity. In Daniel in the 7th chapter, Daniel prophesies about this dragon, about these kingdoms. All of this points to European kingdoms that will come into play, who will exercise power and authority, or try to, over Israel, okay? In Daniel chapter 7, the Antichrist, he before coming up to Christ's second coming, it's represented by 4 beasts. And between them, between the four beasts, they all have 7 heads. The first, second, and the fourth beast all have 1 head, and the third beast has 4 heads. You can read that in Daniel chapter 7. That'll be your homework for tonight, okay? So if you want further explanation on that, look at that, okay? It speaks really to his universal dominion as the prince of this fallen world. In verse 6, it says, "Then the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there." During the Old Testament days, Satan has always tried to destroy Israel. The Bible talks about in 1 Peter that he's like a roaring lion going to and fro and seeking whom he may devour. We'll see that some more through Revelation. But Satan's number one goal has always been to try to destroy Christ and his work. And in the Old Testament, he attempted to do that by destroying Israel, knowing that Israel was the nation that was going to give birth to the Messiah. Okay? And then after Jesus was born, what did Satan try to do? Tried to kill Jesus himself, right? And of all the way to the cross, he was attempting to destroy Christ. And in the ages to come, he's still going to try to kill Christ. He's still going to try to destroy the Jews. Even in the tribulation time, the 144 witnesses, the 2 witnesses that we read about a couple of weeks ago, all of these Satan is trying to destroy so that he can destroy the work of Christ. Okay? He is always on the attack. Well, I was just getting there. Turn to Matthew chapter 24. Good timing, Steve. Thanks for helping me move along. Matthew chapter 24. Look in verse 15. "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand." So those Jews that are going to be here on earth, when they see this take place, the midpoint of the tribulation, and remember, they're studying the Scriptures. They're studying Daniel more than they are Revelation. Okay? They're studying the Old Testament, not the New Testament. But all of a sudden, all those things that Daniel and Jeremiah and all those Old Testament prophets are teaching them, when they get to this midpoint of the tribulation, then they're going to read this again with a new understanding, and they're going to flee into the wilderness. It says, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight might not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time. No, nor ever shall be." And he talks about his days being shortened and all those kind of things. Okay? And so when we get to this point, they're going to read the Word, and all of a sudden they're going to have an understanding, and they're going to fulfill verse 6. They're going to flee to the wilderness. We're going to talk about Petra. Okay? Let me see. I know we're kind of running out of times. Let me get to that next week, because we're going to kind of finish this chapter, okay? Yes, we're going to talk about Petra next week. We're going to talk about whether or not Petra is the place that the Jews will flee to. Is Petra the wilderness that the Jews flee to? Okay? There's going to be Gentiles that are going to be there. whether it's prepared now or whether it will be prepared, but it's going to be a prepared place. He's already, and I mean, you could say that it's all been established before the foundation of the world. In God's eyes, it's already prepared. Yeah. 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 We're gonna find that out. The scriptures actually tell us and give us some insight to that. So we'll get to those scriptures next week. Okay. All right. Any other questions about the woman or the dragon tonight? Okay. Okay, chapter 2, it says, then being with child, she cried out in labor and pain and gave birth. I don't think there's a significance in that. Yeah, it is. It is. Yes, it's absolutely a description of a pregnant woman. It is a reference to Jesus. I don't think that there's a significance in it not being capitalized, because later it talks about in verse 4 that child is mentioned or described in a capital letter in an uppercase. And so I think the reference in chapter 2 is just a description of the woman. The focus is not on the child itself. Okay? All right. Good stuff. Go home and figure out where Petra is. Let's pray.